People told themselves their past with stories, explained their present with stories, foretold the future with stories. The best place by the fire was kept for the storyteller. Greetings, Wanderer, and welcome to Yindy's Tips and Tricks. When deciding on a topic for this week's video, it made sense to start at the very beginning. And by that, I mean an introduction, not only to the wider TTRPG community in general, but a video that long-term Dungeons and Dragons players can send to their concerned and slightly confused relatives on what this whole D&D thing actually is. Because let's face it, explaining to work colleagues why you can't make it out for drinks this weekend because an American couple has hired you to be their dungeon master can get slightly awkward. We also play Dungeons and Dragons afterwards. All joking aside, I was explaining this quirky little D&D web series I put together when a co-worker genuinely turned around and asked me, "So what exactly is D&D?" And that got me thinking, how do you explain this quirky little hobby of ours as simply as possible? Okay, yes, for those that are already deep into the TTRPG community, I know this is overly simplistic, but this isn't for you. This is for the muggles. I mean the uninitiated. I'll be using the terms D&D and TTRPG interchangeably, but effectively, this was the sales pitch that I gave the comedians to convince them to join the show. Put simply, did you ever play that game Storyteller as a child? The one where one of you would start the story off, then hand it over to the next person, and they'd hand it over to the person after them, and so on and so on. D&D is basically that, but with dice rolls and character sheets. Every time your character tries to do something, you roll the dice and add the number from your character sheet. Roll high enough, you succeed, and the story continues. However, if you roll poorly, you mess up. Something unexpected happens. You must deal with the consequences. But most importantly of all, the story still continues. That's 95% of D&D and most other TTRPGs. Yes, I can already feel some of you frothing at the mouth going, but there's so much more nuance than that. But let's keep it simple for now. But why do you keep saying TTRPG instead of just D&D? And what's the difference? Simple answer, D&D is the brand, whereas TTRPG, Tabletop Role-Playing Game, is the broader category of product. It's the same difference between a Hoover and a vacuum cleaner, or Google and a search engine. Just like how people might say, I'll quickly go Google that, even if they're using a different search engine like Bing. I know, apparently these people exist. I might say I'm playing D&D tonight, even if the game that we're playing is something like Pathfinder or Call of Cthulhu. It's just easier than explaining every little detail. Kind of like when your gran would call every gaming console that you owned a Nintendo. Close enough, gran. Close enough. But isn't D&D a board game? Or like them Warhammers? Okay, first off, it's Warhammer, not Warhammers. But I'll let that one slide. There are some D&D board games out there that serve as a great introduction to tabletop games in general, such as Warhammer and HeroQuest. They tend to focus on the more dungeon crawling elements, foregoing more of the roleplay and narrative elements of TTRPGs, and focus more on combat and loot. As for Warhammer itself, it's a competitive tactical game, where players pitch vast armies against one another until one player proves victorious. Now, there are many Warhammer TTRPG games out there, but they're different from the miniature war games sold by Games Workshop. You know, that shop in town that smells of teenage boys, feet, and wet hamster. What? You know it's true. The big difference is it's all about winning. In theory, the game has to be at least balanced and fair. Unless it's Warhammer. It's a lot like a game of chess. The players have to agree on the set of rules before the game begins. You can't just suddenly declare that your queen now has 3 lives and is equipped with a minigun. As awesome as that would be. Whereas in a TTRPG, the only win condition is that you and your players are having fun. But if it's that simple, why all the rulebooks, miniatures and maps? All optional. Here's a fun fact. Did you know you can't legally copyright game mechanics? That's why if you go into the App Store, you'll see 1,000 different Scrabble clones, all with slightly different names. The brand Monopoly is a trademark. However, the idea of moving around a board and bankrupting your friends, that isn't. That's just called capitalism. The same is true of D&D. See that mountain of books behind me? All of them optional. Guidelines. Tools for inspiration. If a rule isn't working for you and your table, you can change it. But that's the other great thing about D&D and TTRPGs in general. Unlike a computer game, especially nowadays, where the game that you have access to a few years down the line may no longer resemble the one that you originally bought. If you don't like your current version of the game, go back to a previous one. It's still there. I mean, it's not like Wizards of the Coast are going to send round the D&D police to kick down your door and steal it off your shelf. Or even worse, send the Pinkertons round to threaten you. No, they only do that with Magic the Gathering apparently. So how do I get started, and what do I need? Honestly, you just need a group of like-minded friends willing to get together of an evening and play make-believe. The books, miniatures and accessories, they're nice to have, but not necessary. Yes, I know there's such a thing as solo RPGs out there. But let's face it, we're here for the social interaction, not reading a choose-your-own-adventure book. Let's try a quick thought experiment. Say, for example, I'm locked in the woods with a group of players, and we have no access to internet, rulebooks, miniatures, character sheets, or fancy dice. All we have is a single D6 Monopoly dice, or maybe not even that, maybe just a single pack of regular old playing cards. Could I, in theory, run a TTRPG one-shot? Yes, I think I could. And I'll show you how. Let's call this hypothetical system the storyteller system. I set the scene. Each player plays a single character and describes their actions. Every time there's a possibility of failure, I get them to roll the dice or perhaps draw a card. If using a d6, let's say that a roll of a 1 is always a failure and a roll of 6 is always a success. Everything in the middle is now a sliding scale based on how difficult you want the task to be. For example, a 4, 5 or a 6 gives the player about a 50% chance of success, and you can change this depending on the story's needs. If you're using a deck of cards, treat it as reverse blackjack. I, as the DM, have a number in my head, and the player draws a card, hoping to beat that number. Now, that's a very simplistic, bare-bones system, but you could totally run a session like that. Now, you'll naturally want to add and tweak rules as needed, but before long, you'll end up with something that's remarkably similar to the official TTRPG systems out there that have done a lot of the hard work for you. My point is that every TTRPG table is different and unique. You don't need to slavishly stick to the rules. Instead, play it your way. Mix it up. Make it your own. Final thoughts. I hope this gives you a starting point, even if you were slightly curious about D&D and TTRPG games in general. Watching actual play shows is also a great way to get into the hobby, like 4 Halfwits and a DM, a little known show starring myself as the Dungeon Master as I take some of the UK's top improv comedians, lock them in a room for 5 hours and force them to play geeky board games with me. Our first extended table session is currently live on our Patreon and will hit YouTube next week. If you found this video at all helpful, make sure to like and subscribe, and make sure to check out all our socials. If you have any RPG or D&D related questions, make sure to check me out at startplaying.games, where I'll be more than happy to help. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Yindy out.